Welcome to Rose Revenge. It is so good to have you here. How has your week been? I'd love to know where you're joining me from today. Please leave a comment below so I can say hello. I watched from the shadows as a mother sent a funeral wreath to her daughter's wedding instead of a blessing. All because the groom worked with his hands. She thought she was publicly shaming them, but she was actually signing the death warrant for her own fortune. You won't believe the shock on her face when she realizes who actually owns her debt. Let's hear Eleanor's story. Eleanor has chosen the path of the low-born. If any of you attend, you are not witnessing a union. You are participating in the desecration of our family's academic tradition. Do not lend your presence to her self-destruction. Those words, sent in a cold mass email to every relative we possessed, were the first thing I thought of as I stood at the threshold of the chapel. My mother, Margaret, a woman who treated our family's Ivy League pedigree like a holy relic, hadn't just declined to attend my wedding. She had issued a formal decree of exile, using her influence to turn my walk down the aisle into a public execution of my social standing. I stood there, my fingers trembling slightly against the stems of my wildflowers, staring at the physical manifestation of her malice. 34 empty chairs. 34 mahogany seats on the bride's side of the sanctuary, each draped with a mocking white silk ribbon that swayed in the draft of the open doors. There were no smiling aunts, no nodding uncles, and no cousins whispering about the dress. There was only a hollow, echoing void that seemed to suck the very oxygen out of the room, orchestrated by the woman who had given me life, but could not give me her respect. The silence in the chapel was profound, a silence of the abyss that Margaret had curated with the precision of a master surgeon. I felt a coldness creeping into my marrow, a jagged, hollow ache that threatened to collapse my lungs. My mother wanted me to feel the weight of every single one of those empty seats. She wanted me to feel small, rejected, and utterly alone as I walked toward a man she considered intellectually incompatible. My mind flashed back to the morning's betrayal, the way that email had looked on my phone screen, black ink on a white background, cutting me out of the family legacy with a few keystrokes of elegant venom. She didn't just stay away. She had quarantined my joy, treating my love for Caleb like a shameful secret that had to be buried. Every empty chair was a message. If I chose a man who worked with his hands, I was no longer a daughter of this house. But the true height of her cruelty was waiting for me at the front of the room. There, sitting in the very first seat, the place reserved for the mother of the bride, was not a person, but a massive, grotesque arrangement of white lilies and dark, weeping greenery. It was a funeral wreath, its cloying, sweet scent filling the air with the smell of death instead of celebration. Tucked into the center of the blooms was a small, cream-colored card with my mother's unmistakable, looping calligraphy. It read, "Condolences for your choice." The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. In Margaret's world, marrying for love outside of our class wasn't just a mistake. It was a tragedy worth mourning. She wanted the funeral wreath to be the last thing I saw before I reached the altar, a final, stinging reminder that I was being buried in her eyes. I felt a hot, prickly sensation behind my eyes, the familiar sting of tears that I refused to let fall. My mother expected me to crumble, to turn back and beg for her approval, to admit that I was lost without the ivory tower she had built around me. But as I stared at those 34 empty chairs, something inside me didn't break. It hardened. If this was what class and tradition looked like, then I wanted no part of it. I wasn't choosing inferiority. I was choosing a life that was real, a life built on something sturdier than social invitations and academic posturing. I tightened my grip on my bouquet, the rough stems grounding me, and I began to walk. The sound of my heels clicking against the cold stone floor echoed off the empty mahogany pews, a rhythmic, lonely sound that felt like the beating of a heart finally waking up. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the funeral lilies or the vacant rows again. At the end of that long, silent gauntlet stood Caleb. He looked uncomfortable in a rented tuxedo that didn't quite accommodate the breadth of his powerful, working man's shoulders, but his eyes were steady and filled with a warmth that my mother's world had never known. He saw the empty chairs, and I watched his jaw tighten, his large, calloused hands clenching at his sides as he realized the magnitude of the insult my mother had leveled against me. There was no pity in his gaze, only a fierce, quiet strength that made the 34 empty seats seem utterly insignificant. When I finally reached him, the cloying scent of the funeral wreath was replaced by the faint, honest smell of wood smoke and the metallic tang of the garage that lived in the pores of his skin. He took my hand, his skin rough and warm against mine, a map of hard work and genuine effort that Margaret would never understand. He leaned in, his voice a low, grounding rumble that only I could hear. "Do you have any regrets, Eleanor?" he asked softly, his eyes searching mine for even a flicker of doubt. I looked back over my shoulder one last time at the rows of white ribbons, at the calculated, frozen cruelty of my mother's condolences, and then I looked back at the man who had chosen me for exactly who I was. "No," I replied, my voice clear and cold, carrying through the empty sanctuary with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. "This isn't a funeral, Caleb. This is the day I finally became free." As the pastor began the opening prayer, his voice steady against the hollow silence of the room, my mind drifted away from the 34 empty chairs and back to the Sunday dinners that had built the walls between my mother and me. For Margaret, those dinners were a weekly liturgy where we worshiped at the altar of my brother, Julian. Julian was the golden boy, the one who carried the Ivy League torch and spoke in the polished, empty language of venture capital and market volatility. He would sit at the head of the table in his custom-tailored suits, spinning tales of million-dollar mergers and high-yield returns, while my mother watched him with a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. To her, Julian was the living embodiment of the American dream. Not the kind built with sweat and grit, but the kind polished in boardrooms. I remember the clinking of heavy silver against fine bone china as Julian boasted about disrupting the industry, while I sat in the silence of the abyss, watching the facade grow thinner with every glass of expensive Bordeaux. Everything changed the night I brought Caleb home for the first time. The contrast was almost comical. Caleb sat there, his large frame making the antique Queen Anne chair look like a child's toy, his hands clean, but still bearing the permanent, faint crescent of grease under his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could fully erase. Margaret didn't even wait for the appetizers to be served before she began her interrogation. her voice dripping with the patronizing sweetness she reserved for those she considered her intellectual inferiors. She asked Caleb about his portfolio and his thoughts on emerging market trends. Caleb didn't flinch. He looked her straight in the eye and spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who didn't need to use big words to hide a small soul. "I don't spend much time looking at spreadsheets, Mrs. Thorne," he said, his voice a low, honest rumble. "I spend my time looking at engine blocks. I care about torque, fuel efficiency, and making sure a machine runs the way it was designed to." The silence that followed was so thick you could have cut it with a steak knife. My mother let out a sharp, mocking laugh that sounded like shattering glass. "How charmingly literal," she remarked, her eyes flicking toward Julian as if they shared a private joke at Caleb's expense. Julian chimed in with a smirk, leaning back and adjusting his silk tie. "It's important to have hobbies, Caleb, but we're talking about the real world, the world where numbers move mountains." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a mixture of shame for my family and a fierce, protective pride for the man sitting next to me. Caleb didn't argue. He just took a sip of water, his face a mask of calm, as if he were observing a faulty transmission that he knew would eventually blow itself apart. He saw the red flags that I was still trying to ignore. The way Julian's eyes darted when the conversation turned too specific, and the way my mother seemed to believe her son's lies because the alternative, admitting her golden boy might be a fraud, was too painful to bear. As the weeks turned into months, the divide only grew deeper. I watched as my mother began to treat her retirement fund like Julian's personal piggy bank, her faith in his intellectual superiority blinding her to the most basic financial logic. One evening, I walked into the library to find them huddled over a set of documents. Julian was talking fast, his hands gesturing wildly about a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in a tech-driven logistics firm. Margaret didn't even read the fine print. She just smiled and handed him the keys to the family's legacy, her pride in him acting like a pair of golden blinkers. She looked at me as I stood in the doorway, her expression shifting from warmth to a cold, disappointed mask. "Eleanor, don't look so worried," she snapped. "Julian is building a future for this family. You should focus on your mechanic. Though I suppose when the car breaks down, you'll at least have someone to call for a tow." The memory of that dismissal echoed in my mind as I stood at the altar, Caleb's hand still warm and steady in mine. I realized then that my mother had spent her whole life investing in shadows and mirrors, while I had invested in something that actually had engine endurance. She thought she was the one with the vision, the one who understood the American dream, but she had been swindled by her own vanity. As the pastor's prayer ended and the ceremony moved forward, I knew the memories and cracks were about to become a chasm that would swallow her whole. She had bet everything on a gilded lie, and she had no idea that the grease monkey she had laughed at was the only person in the room who actually knew how to fix what was broken. The memory of those dinner table barbs was nothing compared to the cold, calculated insult that occurred just 1 month before the wedding, a moment that crystallized the red flags I had been trying to suppress. We had driven to the Thorne estate to drop off some final documents for the reception, a visit I had hoped would be a bridge-building exercise, but which turned into a masterclass in class-based contempt. The air was biting and damp as we pulled up the long, winding driveway, the mansion standing like a gray stone sentinel of intellectual air and old money. Caleb was still in his work gear, having come straight from the shop to meet my deadline, and as we stepped onto the pristine white marble of the porch, I saw my mother's face contort through the glass of the front door. She didn't open the door with a hug. She stood there like a border guard, her eyes dropping immediately to Caleb's feet. He was wearing his heavy steel-toed work boots, reliable, worn leather that bore the faint, honest scuffs of a day spent building a business from the ground up. To me, those boots represented security and hard work. But to Margaret, they were a visceral pollution that threatened to soil her carefully curated sanctuary. Before Caleb could even offer a greeting, my mother held up a hand, her voice coming out in that sharp, patronizing tone that always made me feel like a disobedient child. "Caleb, dear, I simply cannot have those objects inside the house," she said, her lip curling as if she were looking at a dead animal rather than the footwear of an honest man. She gestured vaguely toward the edge of the porch, where the wind was whipping up dead leaves and the temperature was dropping toward freezing. "Please leave them outside in the yard. I won't have the smell of cheap grease and manual labor ruining the intellectual atmosphere of my drawing room." I felt a flash of white-hot fury ignite in my chest, a sense of wounded self-respect that made my ears ring. I started to protest, my voice rising to defend the man I loved, but Caleb's hand was suddenly on my arm, his touch cool and steadying. He didn't look offended. He looked at my mother with a quiet, invisible observer curiosity, as if she were a strange specimen under a microscope. Without a word of complaint, Caleb sat on the edge of the stone steps and began to unlace his boots. He placed them neatly on the grass, exposed to the elements, and then stood up in his socks. His posture remains as tall and dignified as any gentleman in a tuxedo. My mother didn't thank him. She simply turned and walked back into the house, leaving him to follow her in his stocking feet like a servant who knew his place. As we walked through the hallway, the contrast was unbearable. The silent, carpeted luxury of the Thorne legacy versus the man who had just been stripped of his dignity at the front door. I watched Caleb as he stood in the living room, surrounded by leather-bound books and oil paintings of ancestors who had probably never worked a day in their lives, and I felt a profound sense of shame for my heritage. But Caleb just caught my eye and gave me a small, knowing smile, a nuzzle of reassurance that suggested he was playing a much deeper game than my mother could ever conceive. It was in that moment, seeing him stand tall despite the calculated humiliation, that my awakening truly began. I realized that Margaret wasn't just defending her carpets. She was desperately trying to maintain a hierarchy that was already starting to crumble beneath her feet. The rest of the visit was a blur of Margaret's diction of expertise as she spoke about Julian's latest high-level investments and the academic compatibility she feared I was throwing away. She ignored Caleb entirely, treating him like a ghost that happened to be standing in her parlor, while he remained a silent strategist, absorbing every detail of her arrogance with an unsettling calm. I looked at his boots through the window, sitting lonely and cold in the yard, and I made a silent vow that one day my mother would realize those boots were made of much stronger material than the fragile glass house she lived in. I didn't know then that the grease monkey she had relegated to the yard was actually the only person with the power to save the very roof over her head. As we finally left, Caleb stepped back into his cold boots without a word, his face illuminated by the setting sun. "Don't worry, Eleanor," he whispered as we walked to the car, his voice filled with a hidden intellectual satisfaction. The cold only makes the leather tougher. Some people just don't understand the value of a solid foundation until the whole house starts to shake. The incident with the boots had been a warning, but the grand fundraising gala my mother hosted 2 weeks later was the true climax of her class-driven cruelty. I had hoped Caleb and I could attend as guests, but Margaret had other plans, treating our presence like a social liability she had to manage with the precision of a damage control expert. The evening was a sprawling, velvet-draped affair designed to showcase the Thorne family's cultural dominance. Yet the tension reached a breaking point when the evening's guest of honor, a billionaire philanthropist with an ego as large as his portfolio, realized his prized vintage Rolls-Royce had died in the middle of the circular driveway, blocking the arrival of other prestigious guests. Margaret began to spiral into a visible panic, her carefully curated image of perfection crumbling as the line of luxury vehicles backed up toward the main road. When she spotted Caleb standing in the shadows of the foyer, she didn't see her son-in-law. She saw a grease monkey she could exploit to save her social standing. In a voice that was both a command and a dismissal, she ordered him to go to the garage, put on a pair of industrial coveralls, and enter through the back servants' gate so the real guests wouldn't have to witness a common mechanic mingling in the ballroom. I felt a surge of white-hot indignation, stepping forward to tell my mother exactly what I thought of her backdoor policy. But Caleb's hand was a firm, grounding weight on my shoulder. He didn't look angry. He looked at Margaret with a calm, almost pitying detachment that made her frantic elitism seem small and desperate. "It's all right, Eleanor," he whispered, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the noise of the panicking crowd. "Let me help her save face one last time." There was a flicker of intellectual satisfaction in his eyes as he followed the butler toward the service entrance. A man who knew his worth didn't depend on which door he walked through. I stood by the window, watching him disappear into the dark, feeling a profound sense of wounded self-respect for my mother's soul, even as I marveled at Caleb's quiet strength. Less than 10 minutes later, the silence of the night was broken by the smooth, rhythmic purr of a perfectly tuned 12-cylinder engine. Caleb had diagnosed and fixed the issue with the efficiency of a master craftsman, his hands moving with a grace that Margaret would never acknowledge as a form of intelligence. As he wiped a smudge of oil from his thumb and prepared to retreat back through the servants' gate, the billionaire owner of the car stepped out onto the gravel, his eyes widening in genuine shock as he caught a clear glimpse of Caleb's face under the flickering porch lights. There was a long, heavy pause where the air seemed to hum with an unstated truth. The tycoon didn't look at Caleb like a hired hand. He looked at him with a startling mix of confusion and deep-seated respect, as if he had just discovered a king hiding in a workshop. He opened his mouth to speak, to call out a name that certainly wasn't just Caleb the mechanic. But Caleb simply gave a subtle, sharp shake of his head, a silent command from one powerful man to another. My mother, oblivious to the slow reveal happening right in front of her, hurried over to the billionaire, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she apologized for the inconvenience caused by the help. She had no idea that the man she was shooing toward the back gate was the very reason the man she was trying to impress was now looking at her with an expression of profound, silent pity. The billionaire's look of bewildered respect lingered in my mind like a ghost, haunting the edges of my thoughts as the lights of the gala finally dimmed. While my mother was busy preening over her social save, I found myself wandering into the darkened corridor near my father's old study, seeking a moment of quiet away from the suffocating scent of expensive perfume and hollow laughter. The mansion, which had always felt like a fortress of academic superiority, suddenly felt fragile, as if the very foundations were made of sand instead of stone. It was there, hidden by the heavy velvet drapes of the library, that I heard a sound that chilled me more than the winter wind outside. The voice of the golden boy, Julian, stripped of its usual boardroom bravado. He wasn't speaking with his usual polished eloquence. His voice was reedy, frantic, and laced with a desperate terror that made my blood run cold. I stood perfectly still, an invisible observer in the house where I had been raised. Julian was on the phone, his words coming in rapid-fire bursts as he paced the mahogany floor. "You don't understand. The margin call came in this morning," he hissed into the receiver, the sound of his frantic footsteps echoing against the built-in bookshelves. "The tech logistics firm didn't just dip, it evaporated. The entire fund is gone. It's scorched earth, do you hear me?" My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't just talking about a bad investment. He was talking about a total collapse. I listened, breathless, as he admitted the unthinkable. He had leveraged the Thorne estate, the very house we were standing in, to cover his gambling debts in the high-stakes world of hedge funds. To our mother, this house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was the American dream personified, the sacred diadem of a lifetime of work. And Julian had placed it on the roulette wheel and lost. Then came the scratching of a pen, a sound so small yet so violent in the silence of the night. "I'm signing the documents now," Julian muttered, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I'll have her signature mirrored perfectly. She won't know the deed is being transferred to a holding company until the auction notice is on the front door. I just need more time to gully the secondary market." My stomach twisted in a knot of pure, unadulterated revulsion. This was the intellectual my mother had spent decades championing. This was the man who looked down on Caleb for having grease under his fingernails. I realized then that while Caleb spent his days building engines that could endure thousands of miles, Julian spent his nights tearing down the very roof over our mother's head with nothing but a pen and a lie. The contrast was a red flag so bright it felt like a physical heat. One man created value with his hands, while the other destroyed a legacy with his mind. A wave of intellectual satisfaction washed over me, though it was tinged with a bitter sorrow. I finally saw the golden boy for what he truly was, a hollow shell, a parasite feeding on a mother's blind pride. I thought of Caleb, relegated to the servants' entrance just hours ago, and felt a surge of wounded self-respect on his behalf. My mother's world was a house of cards, and her favorite son had just pulled the bottom one out. I considered stepping out of the shadows, confronting Julian then and there, and dragging him before our mother to show her the receipts of his betrayal. But I stopped myself. I knew Margaret. She was still blinded by the gold-plated bars of her own vanity. If I spoke now, without irrefutable proof, she would only see it as an attack on her favorite child. She would choose the lie she loved over the truth she feared. I retreated deeper into the silence of the abyss, my mind already racing with a new secret strategy. I would not be the victim of this collapse, and I would not let Caleb be the scapegoat for a failure he had no part in. I realized that this was the moment of awakening, the realization that the people we are taught to look up to are often the ones we should fear the most. I would watch. I would wait. I would let Julian think his forgery was successful, all while I worked in the darkness to gather the receipts that would eventually lead to his downfall. As I slipped back toward my own room, the faint scent of Caleb's wood smoke soap on my skin felt like a shield. The Thorne family was about to lose everything they thought they owned, and I was the only one who knew that the mechanic in the backyard was the only one who actually knew how to rebuild a broken engine. The memories and cracks in this house were finally wide enough for the truth to come pouring through. I lay in bed that night, the darkness of the room pressing in on me. But for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I was a silent strategist now. I would let the American dream that Margaret worshipped crumble, because only when the rubble was cleared could we see the value of the dirt beneath it. I thought about the 34 empty chairs at my wedding and the funeral wreath my mother had sent. She had mourned the death of my social status, but she was the one whose world was actually dying. I closed my eyes, listening to the house creak, and whispered a silent promise to the shadows. Julian would have his time in the spotlight, but when the curtains finally fell, I would be the one holding the script for the rebirth. It's heartbreaking to see a mother value a title more than her own daughter's happiness, isn't it? Have you ever felt judged by someone who didn't even know your true worth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're rooting for Eleanor and Caleb, please give this video a like and comment, "I see you." The weeks following the gala felt like a slow-motion car crash, one where you can see the glass shattering long before you hear the impact. I returned to the mansion one morning, ostensibly to collect the last of my childhood books, but really to act as an invisible observer of the cracks that were finally spiderwebbing across my mother's gilded life. The atmosphere in the breakfast room was stifling, thick with the smell of cold Earl Grey tea and the unsaid truths that were beginning to rot the foundation of the house. I found my mother sitting at the head of the long mahogany table, her back as straight as ever, but her hands were trembling as she stared at a single sheet of paper with a bold red header. It was a formal notice from the bank, and even from across the room, I could recognize the cold, clinical font of a foreclosure warning. Margaret's face was a mask of pale, frozen disbelief, the color of old parchment. Before she could even process the words on the page, Julian was there, swooping in like a vulture trying to hide its kill. He snatched the paper from her fingers with a frantic, forced chuckle, his movements lacking the smooth, academic grace he usually performed so well. He began his usual routine of intellectual gaslighting, his voice high and reedy as he talked about system errors, clerical oversights, and temporary liquidity adjustments. He told her that his high-level algorithms had simply triggered a false alert in the bank's outdated software, and that a single phone call from his office would rectify the unfortunate misunderstanding. I watched from the doorway, a silent strategist in the silence of the abyss, seeing something I had never seen before in 40 years. The flickering shadow of doubt in my mother's eyes. For the first time, she didn't just nod and accept his intellectual explanation. She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the beads of sweat on his upper lip and the way his expensive silk tie was knotted just a fraction too tight. It was a moment of profound psychological fracturing. She was a woman of the silent generation, raised to believe that status was a shield and that golden boys like Julian were invincible. But that belief was now being interrogated by the terrifying reality of a bank notice. My heart ached for her, a sudden surge of grief that I hadn't expected to feel after the funeral wreath incident. Despite her cruelty, she was my mother, and I was watching her world, her American dream, dissolve into a nightmare of financial insecurity. I wanted to step forward, to tell her that I knew exactly what Julian had done, but I held back. I knew that Margaret was still clinging to Julian like a drowning woman clings to a lead weight. She wasn't ready to let go of the status buoy that had kept her ego afloat for decades. To admit Julian was a failure was to admit her own life's investment was a waste, and that was a truth her pride wasn't yet strong enough to bear. The tension in the room was a living thing, a reminder that the truth eventually comes out from the bag, no matter how many layers of gold plating you hide it under. Julian continued his frantic babbling, his lies becoming increasingly desperate as he tried to distract her with talk of a new logistics venture that would solve everything by the end of the quarter. He was a man who used his mind to destroy, a sharp contrast to Caleb, who was currently at his garage, building things that actually worked. I realized then that the Thorne family legacy was no longer a fortress. It was a cage, and the bars were starting to rust away in real time. Just as Julian was reaching the crescendo of his fabricated excuses, the heavy silence of the mansion was punctured by a sound that felt like a gunshot. It wasn't the arrival of a prestigious guest or delivery of fine wine. It was the doorbell, sharp, insistent, and utterly devoid of social grace. Margaret jumped, her hand flying to her throat, while Julian froze, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. Through the frosted glass of the front door, I saw the silhouette of two men carrying clipboards and measuring tapes. They weren't there for a social visit. They were asset appraisers, the harbingers of a collapse that even Julian's most polished lies could no longer prevent. The cracks in the gilded layer had finally shattered wide open. The asset appraisers left the Thorne mansion with the clinical efficiency of coroners, leaving a silence behind that was heavier and more suffocating than the air in a tomb. I stood in the kitchen, the linoleum cold beneath my feet, listening to the ghost of my mother's once mighty social standing evaporate in real time. From the hallway, I watched Margaret retreat into her mahogany-clad library, the sanctuary where she had spent decades curating her intellectual legacy. For the first time in my life, her back wasn't perfectly straight. It was slightly bowed, as if the very weight of the family name was finally crushing her spine. She picked up the vintage telephone, her knuckles white as she began to dial the numbers of the people she had considered her inner circle. The academics, the philanthropists, and the old money elites she had championed for 40 years. Through the half-open door, I became the silent strategist of her downfall, an invisible observer to the most brutal lesson in social Darwinism I had ever witnessed. Margaret called Evelyn, a woman whose foundation she had saved from bankruptcy 5 years ago. I heard my mother's voice, usually so resonant and commanding, dip into a reedy, desperate register as she mentioned a temporary liquidity challenge and the need for a short-term bridge loan. The response was a sharp, clinical click of a hang-up that echoed through the library like a gunshot. She called the dean of the university, a man who had toasted her intellectual brilliance at a dozen galas. His secretary took the call, her voice as cold as a frozen lake, informing my mother that the dean was permanently unavailable for personal consultations regarding financial matters. It was a systematic, ruthless turning of the tide. The very people Margaret had mobilized to boycott my wedding only months ago were now treating her like a contagious disease. They didn't just decline to help, they acted as if she had already ceased to exist. The irony was a bitter, metallic tang in the back of my throat. My mother had spent her life building a fortress of status, believing that class was a shield that would protect her from the vulgar realities of the world. But status, I realized as I listened to her third consecutive rejection, is a fair-weather friend. It is a currency that only holds value as long as you have more of it than everyone else. When the gold leaf starts to peel, the elites don't offer a hand to help. They pull back their skirts to avoid the dust. I moved closer to the library door, the silence of the abyss punctuated only by the soft, ragged sound of a woman who had finally run out of lies to tell herself. Margaret wasn't just losing a house, she was losing her entire identity. She sat at her desk, the phone receiver resting in her lap like a dead weight, and let out a single, broken sob that she tried to stifle with a lace handkerchief. It was the sound of a matriarch realizing that her American dream had been a hollow facade, and that the golden boy she had sacrificed everything for was nothing more than a polished mirage. I wanted to go to her, to offer some form of comfort, but I knew my presence would only be another reminder of the inferiority she had accused me of choosing. The final blow, however, didn't come from a phone call or a social snub. It came from the driveway. I heard the aggressive, high-pitched roar of a luxury engine, the signature scream of Julian's Italian sports car. I stepped to the window and watched my brother, the intellectual giant of our family, throw a single leather duffel bag into the passenger seat. He didn't look back at the mansion. He didn't go into the library to say goodbye to the mother who had world-mapped his every success. He simply shifted into gear and sped away, the tires kicking up gravel against the stone pillars of the gate. He was taking the only asset he had left that wasn't yet seized by the bank, leaving Margaret alone to face the auction notices and the investigators. I walked back into the library, my footsteps soft on the Persian rug. Margaret didn't even look up as she stared at the official sealing notice that now sat on top of her family Bible. The house was quiet now, a hollow shell of its former glory, stripped of its guests, its furniture, and its dignity. "He's gone, Mother," I said softly, the words hanging in the stagnant air. She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the mahogany walls that were no longer hers. The golden boy had vanished with the last of the liquid assets, and for the first time in 70 years, Margaret Thorne was truly, utterly alone. The morning of the final eviction arrived with a gray, biting wind that whistled through the gaps of the Thorne estate, a sound that felt like the mansion itself was sighing in defeat. The bank's white moving trucks were already idling in the driveway, their exhaust plumes curling into the cold air like ghosts of the life we were leaving behind. I stood in the center of the library, the silence of the abyss weighing heavy on my shoulders as I watched my mother. Margaret was a shadow of her former self, her hands trembling as she wrapped a delicate 18th century porcelain tea set in old newspapers, pieces that had survived 2 world wars but couldn't survive her own son's greed. She didn't look up when I entered. She was fixated on a collection of rare leather-bound books, her last desperate connection to the intellectual legacy she had spent a lifetime building. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the bitter tang of a dying American dream. I felt a profound sense of sorrow, not for the lost furniture, but for the realization that the woman who had once commanded rooms with a single glance was now reduced to haggling with the inevitability of a bank notice. The front doors were kicked open with a violence that made the crystal chandelier rattle. Julian didn't walk in, he invaded, his eyes darting across the room with a frantic, predatory hunger. He wasn't there to offer comfort or to help with the heavy lifting. He was a vulture returning to pick the last bit of meat off the bone. He ignored me entirely and went straight for the small velvet-lined box on the desk where our mother kept the family's heirloom jewelry. "You can't take those, Julian," I said, my voice steady but cold as ice. He spun around, his face a contorted mask of desperation and arrogance that made my blood run cold. "Shut up, Eleanor," he hissed, his voice curt and stripped of its former boardroom polish. He turned his venom toward Margaret, who was frozen with a porcelain cup in her hand. "You should have liquidated these funds when I told you, Mother. If you hadn't been so stubborn about preserving the legacy, I could have saved the account. This is your fault. You've become nothing but a burden, an obsolete old woman clinging to a house you can't even afford to heat." The cruelty of his words was a red flag that had finally turned into a physical blow. My mother's face went white, the porcelain cup slipping from her fingers and shattering on the hardwood floor, a sound that signaled the final breaking point of her blind devotion to the golden boy. I stepped between them, my heart hammering with a mixture of fear and white-hot anger. "Get out, Julian," I commanded. "You've taken enough." He laughed, a high, reedy sound that lacked any real humor. "I'll take whatever I want. This American dream is dead, and I'm not going down with the ship." When I tried to grab the jewelry box, Julian's mask of academic superiority slipped completely. He shoved me aside with a brutal force that sent me stumbling back against a bookshelf, my shoulder hitting the wood with a dull thud as I fell to the floor. Margaret let out a strangled cry, her world finally collapsing into the reality that the son she had worshipped was capable of violence against his own blood just to save his pride. The room was filled with the heavy, suffocating weight of the aftermath, until a new sound cut through the tension, a sound that didn't belong in the Thorne Library. It was the deep, rhythmic roar of a heavy-duty diesel engine, the kind of powerful, honest machinery that Margaret had once banned from her sight. The sound grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards until it seemed to rattle the very foundations of the house. Through the tall library windows, I saw a black, heavy-duty truck pull up behind the bank's moving vans. The door opened, and Caleb stepped out. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a custom-tailored suit. He was in his grease-stained work gear, his boots heavy and solid on the gravel. He looked like a man who possessed a solid foundation that Julian could never comprehend. As he walked toward the front door, his posture wasn't that of a mechanic coming to fix a leak. He had the aura of a protector, a man who had spent his life building while my brother had spent his destroying. The silence of the abyss was over. The man who had been told to use the back door was finally coming through the front. Caleb walked into the library with a slow, deliberate stride that seemed to reclaim the room from Julian's frantic energy. His heavy work boots, the same ones Margaret had once banished to the yard, thudded with a heavy, grounding finality on the hardwood floor. Julian, still clutching the jewelry box and breathing like a cornered animal, let out a sharp, jagged laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "What are you doing here, Caleb? Did you come to fix the radiator? Or are you here to look at the pipes one last time before the bank hauls this place to the scrap heap?" He straightened his silk tie, attempting to regain his golden boy mask of intellectual superiority, even as his world burned. "This isn't a garage. This is a private matter for people who understand complex financial instruments, not for someone whose biggest achievement is changing a spark plug." Caleb didn't answer right away. He just looked at Julian with a quiet, devastating pity that made my brother's arrogance seem small and pathetic. He reached into the pocket of his canvas jacket and pulled out a thick, manila envelope, placing it calmly on the mahogany desk next to the shattered porcelain. "I've spent 15 years learning how to listen to machines, Julian," Caleb said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the room's entire attention. "Engines don't lie. They tell you exactly where the friction is, where the oil is leaking, and where the metal is starting to fatigue." He tapped the envelope with one calloused finger. "And your sister and I have been listening to the engine of this family for a long time. We heard it seizing up months ago." Julian's face went from a sneer to a mask of confusion as he tore open the envelope. I stood up from the floor, my shoulder throbbing, and watched as the blood drained from his cheeks until he looked like a ghost haunting his own library. In his hands were the receipts, the legal certificates of debt acquisition and property titles. Caleb hadn't just been fixing cars for the elite. He was the founder and owner of the Summit Performance Group, a multi-million-dollar empire that serviced the very billionaires Julian had been trying to impress. Caleb had used his personal capital to buy the Thorne Mansion's mortgage directly from the bank the moment it hit the secondary market. But he hadn't stopped there. He had also acquired the predatory personal loans Julian had taken out under forged signatures, effectively becoming my brother's sole creditor. The intellectual satisfaction of that moment was a physical warmth in my chest, a catharsis I had waited a lifetime to feel. Julian began to tremble, the papers rustling in his hands like dying birds. "This isn't possible," he stammered, his voice breaking into a reedy, desperate whine. "A mechanic doesn't have this kind of liquidity. You're a grease monkey." Caleb took a step forward, not with violence, but with the immovable presence of a man who had built a solid foundation with his own two hands. "The people who own the cars I build don't care about my pedigree, Julian. They care that the machine works, and right now, I own the machine that is your life." Margaret sat frozen in her chair, her eyes fixed on the man she had once made walk through the back gate. She looked at Caleb's hands, the rough skin, the faint, permanent oil in the creases, and for the first time, she saw them as the lifebuoy they truly were. She looked at the son she had worshipped and saw only the wreckage of a lie. Caleb turned his gaze toward her, his expression softening but remaining firm. He didn't gloat, and he didn't throw her rejection back in her face. He spoke with the quiet authority of the man who had truly achieved the American dream. "I apologize for entering through the front door without an invitation today, Mother Thorne," Caleb said, his voice echoing through the silent mansion. "But from now on, you don't have to go anywhere. This house is safe. The Golden Boy is done, but the engine is finally being rebuilt." The silence that followed Caleb's revelation was heavy, but it was no longer the suffocating silence of the abyss I had grown used to. It was a healing language of transition, the sound of a woman's entire worldview shattering and reassembling itself in the span of a few heartbeats. My mother sat perfectly still in her high-backed mahogany chair, her gaze fixed with an almost hypnotic intensity on Caleb's hands. They were the same hands she had spent months mocking, the rough, calloused, grease-stained hands of a man she had dismissed as intellectually incompatible. But as she looked at the legal documents proving he had bought her debt and saved her legacy, those hands transformed before her very eyes. She didn't see cheap grease or manual labor anymore. She saw the solid foundation of a man who had built a real American dream, while her golden boy had been busy burning it to the ground. Julian had already slunk away like a whipped cur, his intellectual superiority proving to be a paper-thin shield against the crushing reality of his own cowardice. Margaret didn't even look at him as he retreated into the shadows of the hallway. Her focus remained entirely on Caleb. I stood by the library window, an invisible observer to a miracle of transformation I never thought I would witness in this house. My mother finally moved, her delicate porcelain-pale fingers trembling as she reached out and took Caleb's large, scarred hand in hers. She didn't say the word sorry. Her pride was still a jagged, fragile thing. But she didn't need to. I watched from across the room as she lowered her head, her tears falling silently onto the leather of his work boots, mixing with the dust of the yard and the faint, honest scent of motor oil. It was a profoundly humanizing moment, a therapeutic release for a woman who had been trapped in the gold-plated bars of her own vanity for over 70 years. The anxiety over financial security that had gripped her was gone, replaced by a raw, naked awakening to what actually held value in this world. Then, she did something that signaled a true rebirth of our family. She stood up, wiped her eyes with her lace handkerchief, and walked toward the front entrance where Caleb's boots had been sitting. She didn't treat them like a visceral pollution this time. She picked them up with a quiet reverence and carried them deep into the house, placing them squarely on the expensive Persian rug in the center of the foyer. It was her silent decree that the back door was closed forever, and the substance of the man I loved was finally, irrevocably welcome in her home. I looked at Caleb, and the intellectual satisfaction in his eyes wasn't about the power he held. It was about the justice of finally being seen for the strength of his character rather than the dirt on his hands. 6 months have passed since the foundations of the Thorne estate were shaken to their core, and as I stand on the sprawling stone terrace today, the air feels lighter, stripped of the suffocating weight of centuries-old expectations. The late afternoon sun casts a warm golden hue over the lawn where we are hosting a small, intimate celebration for our first anniversary. There are no white silk ribbons today, and there are certainly no 34 empty chairs. Instead, the space is filled with a vibrant, eclectic mix of people that my mother would have once considered intellectually incompatible with our family name. I watch as Margaret, dressed in a simple but elegant linen suit, laughs genuinely while pouring iced tea for Caleb's lead shop foreman and his wife. She isn't performing for a social circle or calculating her status. She is simply a woman among friends, having finally traded the gold-plated bars of her vanity for the authentic warmth of human connection. The guest list for this new chapter would have been an unthinkable scandal just a year ago. Margaret personally sent out invitations to our hard-working neighbors and the entire staff from Caleb's garage, the very people whose presence she once would have categorized as a visceral pollution. The transformation in her is nothing short of a rebirth. I see her leaning in to listen as one of the mechanics explains the intricate restoration of a vintage engine, her eyes showing a newfound intellectual satisfaction in the mastery of real, tangible things. She has learned that true American dream success isn't found in a leveraged portfolio or a hollow degree, but in the solid foundation of character and the willingness to get one's hands dirty for something that lasts. As for Julian, his absence is the most profound form of justice this family has ever known. He was officially removed from the family legacy and stripped of the Thorne name he so carelessly gambled away. I heard recently from a distant acquaintance that he is currently working a menial job in another state, forced for the first time in his life to pull himself up by his bootstraps to pay back the staggering debts he accrued through his own arrogance. I don't feel the sharp, cold thirst for revenge I once did. Instead, I feel a quiet, humanizing pity for him. He is living in the very inferiority he once projected onto Caleb, a man who had to lose his reflection in the mirror to finally understand the value of the dirt beneath his feet. He is no longer a golden boy, just a man learning the hard lesson that a mind used for destruction will eventually have no roof to hide under. My gaze drifts to the edge of the rose garden, where Caleb is helping my mother prune a stubborn set of hedges. He is still the same man, broad-shouldered, quiet, and possessing a strength that doesn't need to roar to be felt. They are discussing the engine endurance of the plants, their voices a soft, healing language that blends with the rustle of the leaves. I realize then that real elegance isn't found in a perfectly curated guest list or a collection of rare books. It is found in the way we appreciate or cherish those who stand by us when the world falls apart. My mother, once the cold matriarch of an ivory tower, has finally found peace in the company of a man who knows how to fix what is broken. The American dream that this house was built on has been redefined. It is no longer a dream of exclusion and academic posturing, but a dream of rebirth and justice for those who work with their hearts and their hands. I touch the simple gold band on my finger and feel a deep, therapeutic sense of peace. I used to think I was the one who needed to be saved from the empty chairs at my wedding, but the truth is, the mechanic's debt was never about money. It was about paying back a family's arrogance with a quiet, persistent grace. I have learned that the most beautiful things in life aren't found in a polished drawing room. Sometimes the most brilliant diamonds are the ones you find hidden in the rough, calloused creases of a pair of grease-stained hands. Watching Margaret realize that the grease she feared was actually the only thing keeping her life from falling apart was a powerful moment. It reminds us that dignity isn't found in a clean suit, but in a clean heart and hard work. The lesson here is simple. Never look down on someone just because their path is different from yours. True wealth is not what you have in the bank, but who stands by you when the bank is empty. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever had a Caleb in your life who proved everyone wrong? Share your stories below. I read every single one. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of justice and healing. See you in the next one.